In the summer of 1919, a yellowed envelope arrived at the offices of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, bearing no return address and postmarked from the French Quarter. The letter inside, written in elegant script that seemed almost mockingly refined, would become one of the most chilling documents in American criminal history. Dr. Patricia Rousseau, a criminologist studying historical serial killers, discovered this correspondence in the newspaper's archives in 1985, along with a collection of evidence that had been sealed away for nearly 7 decades. What she initially approached as an academic exercise in criminal psychology would evolve into an investigation that challenged her understanding of human evil and the very nature of predatory behavior. The letter began with words that still send chills through those who study criminal correspondence. "Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I'm not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." The author identified himself simply as the Axeman, a moniker that had already struck terror into the hearts of New Orleans residents during the most brutal crime spree in the city's history. Dr. Rousseau's initial research into the Axeman murders had been prompted by inconsistencies she noticed while compiling a database of 20th-century serial killers. The New Orleans case stood apart from other criminal investigations of the era, not only because of the killer's apparent supernatural claims, but because of the methodical nature of the crimes combined with bizarre elements that defied conventional criminal profiling. Between 1918 and 1919, the Axeman had murdered at least 6 people and seriously wounded 6 others, yet no witness had ever provided a reliable description of the perpetrator, and no physical evidence had definitively linked the crimes to any known individual. The murders themselves followed a pattern that was both systematic and seemingly random. The killer targeted Italian grocery store owners and their families, breaking into their homes during the night by chiseling out panels from back doors with surgical precision. The weapon of choice was invariably an axe or razor belonging to the victims themselves, suggesting a perpetrator who arrived unarmed but possessed an intimate knowledge of each household's layout and contents. Most disturbing of all, the killer seemed to move through the city like a ghost, leaving behind scenes of horrific violence, but no trace of his own presence. The first documented attack occurred on May 23, 1918, when Italian grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were found brutally murdered in their home behind their grocery store in the lower 9th Ward. Police arrived to discover that a panel had been chiseled from the back door. The couple's own axe had been used as the murder weapon, and a straight razor had been left beside the bodies. Despite the violence of the attack, neighbors reported hearing no sounds of struggle, no cries for help, leading investigators to wonder how such brutal murders could have been committed in complete silence. The scene at the Maggio home established a pattern that would repeat itself with terrifying consistency throughout 1918 and 1919. Each crime showed evidence of meticulous planning and execution, yet the killer's motivations remained completely opaque. Money and valuables were left untouched, eliminating robbery as a motive. The victims shared Italian heritage and involvement in the grocery business, suggesting some form of ethnic targeting, yet the attacks occurred across different neighborhoods with no apparent geographic logic. Dr. Rousseau's investigation into contemporary police records revealed the extent to which the Axeman murders had baffled law enforcement officials of the era. Detective Joseph D'Antonio, who led the investigation, had documented over 300 interviews with potential witnesses, suspects, and anyone connected to the Italian community in New Orleans. His case files, preserved in the New Orleans Police Department archives, painted a picture of a city gripped by fear and investigators struggling to comprehend a criminal who seemed to operate according to rules that transcended ordinary human behavior. The breakthrough in Dr. Rousseau's research came when she gained access to Detective D'Antonio's personal notes, which had been donated to the Louisiana State Archives by his family in 1982. These handwritten observations, never included in the official police reports, revealed the detective's growing conviction that the Axeman possessed knowledge and capabilities that extended beyond those of a typical criminal. D'Antonio had documented numerous instances where the killer demonstrated an almost supernatural awareness of police movements, always striking when patrols were deployed elsewhere, always choosing homes where resistance would be minimal. "This perpetrator knows our procedures better than our own officers," D'Antonio wrote in a note dated August 1918. "He anticipates our responses, evades our surveillance, and seems to possess intelligence about our operations that should be impossible for any civilian to obtain. I begin to suspect that we are dealing with someone who has studied our methods with the dedication of a scholar, or with an entity that operates according to principles we do not understand." The most disturbing aspect of Detective D'Antonio's private notes was his documentation of supernatural phenomena reported at several crime scenes. Officers had reported experiencing sudden temperature drops while examining the victims' homes, electrical disturbances that caused lights to flicker without apparent cause, and an overwhelming sense of malevolent presence that seemed to linger in the rooms where the murders had occurred. While these observations never appeared in official reports, D'Antonio had carefully recorded each incident, apparently believing that they might provide clues to the killer's identity or methods. The second major attack occurred on June 28, 1918, when Baker Louis Bisuma and his mistress Annie Harriet were found severely wounded in their home. Unlike the Maggio murders, both victims survived the initial assault, though Annie Harriet would die months later from complications related to her injuries. Bisuma's account of the attack provided the first eyewitness testimony about the Axeman, though his description raised more questions than it answered. According to Bisuma, he had been awakened by the sound of someone moving through his house, but when he attempted to investigate, he encountered what he described as a shadow with substance, a darkness that moved with purpose. The attacker had struck him down before he could see any distinguishing features, and his memory of the assault remained fragmentary, even after his recovery. Most unsettling was Bisuma's insistence that his attacker had not entered through the chiseled door panel, but had somehow materialized within the house itself. Dr. Rousseau's analysis of contemporary medical records revealed additional anomalies surrounding the Axeman attacks. Victims who survived the initial assault often reported experiencing vivid nightmares in the weeks following their encounters, dreams that featured a figure in dark clothing who seemed to watch them from the shadows. Several survivors claimed that these dreams felt more real than ordinary nocturnal fantasies, possessing a quality of hyperreality that suggested some form of ongoing supernatural contact with their attacker. If you're as intrigued as we are by these secrets of the past, consider subscribing to not miss any of our future investigations. The Axeman's most audacious communication with the public came in March 1919, when the letter discovered by Dr. Rousseau was published in the Times-Picayune at the killer's specific request. The correspondence demonstrated a level of education and cultural sophistication that contradicted the popular image of serial killers as deranged outcasts. The author displayed familiarity with classical literature, religious imagery, and contemporary social issues, suggesting someone who moved comfortably within educated society while harboring impulses that transcended human morality. "I am very fond of jazz music," the letter continued, "and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night will get the axe." The reference to jazz music provided the first insight into the killer's cultural preferences and established a connection between the murders and the emerging musical culture that was transforming New Orleans into the birthplace of America's most distinctive art form. The timing was significant. 1919 marked the height of jazz's early development, when the music was still considered disreputable by many members of respectable society. The Axeman's embrace of jazz suggested someone who identified with cultural rebellion and artistic innovation, yet channeled these impulses toward destructive rather than creative ends. The letter's threat to spare homes where jazz music was playing created an unprecedented situation in criminal history, a serial killer who offered potential victims a specific method of protection. On the night of March 19, 1919, New Orleans experienced what newspapers later called the Great Jazz Night, as residents throughout the city organized impromptu musical gatherings in response to the Axeman's ultimatum. Dance halls, private homes, and even businesses hired musicians to perform throughout the night, creating a citywide celebration that masked a collective act of terror-driven compliance. True to his word, No attacks occurred on the night designated in the letter, lending credibility to the Axeman's claims and suggesting that he possessed the self-control to honor his bizarre agreement with the city. This restraint distinguished him from other serial killers, who typically escalated their violence over time rather than demonstrating the ability to moderate their behavior according to external conditions. Dr. Rousseau's investigation expanded to include the cultural context surrounding the emergence of jazz music in early 20th century New Orleans. She discovered that the Italian grocery store owners, targeted by the Axeman, occupied a unique position within the city's social hierarchy, serving as intermediaries between the established Creole community and the working-class neighborhoods where jazz was developing. Many of these grocers had immigrated to New Orleans during the same period that jazz was evolving from its African-American roots, creating a complex web of cultural interactions that the killer seemed to understand and exploit. The connection between the murders and the jazz community extended beyond the Axeman's stated musical preferences. Several of the victims had been known to host informal musical gatherings in their homes or businesses, events that brought together musicians and community members across racial and ethnic lines. Dr. Rousseau theorized that the killer might have attended these gatherings, observing potential victims while appearing to participate innocently in the city's cultural life. This theory gained support when Dr. Rousseau discovered that several prominent jazz musicians of the era had reported encounters with a mysterious figure who seemed unusually interested in their personal lives and performance schedules. Jelly Roll Morton, one of the pioneering jazz pianists, had mentioned in a 1938 interview that he remembered a well-dressed man who frequently attended performances during the Axeman period, someone who asked detailed questions about musicians' families and living arrangements, but never seemed to form genuine friendships within the community. The investigation took a personal turn for Dr. Rousseau when she began experiencing dreams that seemed to echo the nightmares reported by Axeman survivors. These nocturnal visions featured a figure in early 20th century clothing who moved through the streets of historical New Orleans with predatory purpose. Unlike ordinary dreams, these experiences possessed a documentary quality that allowed her to observe details of the city's 1919 appearance with historical accuracy that exceeded her conscious knowledge of the period. The dreams intensified as Dr. Rousseau's research progressed, becoming so vivid that she began to document them in the same methodical manner she applied to her academic work. The nocturnal visions revealed aspects of the Axeman case that had not appeared in any historical record, including glimpses of the killer's methods for selecting victims and his apparent ability to move through the city without being observed by police patrols or ordinary citizens. Most disturbing was Dr. Rousseau's growing conviction that the dreams were not products of her own subconscious mind, but rather some form of contact with residual psychic energy left behind by the original crimes. She began to understand why Detective D'Antonio had included supernatural phenomena in his private notes. The Axeman murders had created disturbances that transcended ordinary criminal investigation, leaving behind traces that could be detected by sensitive individuals decades after the original events. The fourth major attack in the Axeman's documented crime spree occurred on August 10, 1918, when Edward Schneider returned home to find his pregnant wife unconscious and bleeding from severe head wounds. Mrs. Schneider survived the assault and eventually gave birth to a healthy daughter, but her account of the attack provided additional evidence of the killer's supernatural characteristics. She reported that her attacker had seemed to appear and disappear like smoke, moving through her home without making any sound that would have alerted neighbors to the violence occurring within. Mrs. Schneider's description included details that aligned with the supernatural phenomena documented by Detective D'Antonio. She described experiencing a sensation of intense cold immediately before the attack, as if the temperature in her home had dropped by 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. She also reported that the assault itself seemed to occur in slow motion, with each moment stretching into an eternity of terror that allowed her to observe details that should have been impossible to perceive during such a traumatic event. The medical examination of Mrs. Schneider revealed injuries that puzzled contemporary physicians. While her wounds were severe, they showed a precision of infliction that suggested medical knowledge on the part of her attacker. The Axeman had somehow managed to cause maximum trauma while avoiding damage to vital organs, as if he possessed an intimate understanding of human anatomy that allowed him to calibrate the level of harm inflicted on each victim. Dr. Rousseau's analysis of medical records from all the Axeman attacks revealed a pattern of surgical precision that supported theories about the killer's possible medical background. Each victim had been wounded in ways that suggested detailed knowledge of human physiology, with injuries inflicted to specific locations that would cause maximum pain and terror, while often allowing the victim to survive long enough to experience the full psychological impact of the assault. As we delve deeper into these mysteries, we invite you to join our community of explorers of the inexplicable. Subscribe and become part of the search for truth. The investigation revealed that the Axeman's knowledge extended beyond anatomy to include understanding of police procedures, criminal investigation techniques, and the social dynamics of early 20th century New Orleans. The killer demonstrated awareness of patrol schedules, knew which homes would be occupied by vulnerable residents, and possessed information about his victims' personal habits that suggested extensive surveillance or supernatural perception. Dr. Rousseau's research into contemporary newspaper accounts revealed that the Axeman murders had created a climate of fear that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The Italian community in New Orleans had responded to the attacks by organizing neighborhood watch groups, hiring private security guards, and establishing communication networks to share information about suspicious activities. Despite these precautions, the killer continued to strike with apparent impunity, always managing to evade detection while leaving behind scenes of carefully orchestrated violence. The most significant attack in the Axeman's crime spree occurred on March 10, 1919, just days before his famous letter appeared in the Times-Picayune. Charles Cortimiglia, his wife Rosa, and their infant daughter Mary were attacked in their home in Gretna, Louisiana, across the river from New Orleans. The assault resulted in the death of little Mary and severe injuries to both parents, marking the first time the killer had murdered a child. The Cortimiglia attack differed from previous crimes in ways that suggested the Axeman's methods were evolving, or that external pressures were affecting his behavior. For the first time, neighbors reported hearing sounds of struggle, suggesting that the victims had been able to resist their attacker more effectively than in previous cases. The crime scene also showed signs of hurried departure, as if the killer had been forced to abandon his usual methodical approach to avoid detection. Rosa Cortimiglia's survival provided investigators with the most detailed eyewitness account of the Axeman's appearance and behavior. Her description painted a picture of an attacker who seemed almost inhuman in his movements and demeanor. She reported that he had moved through their home with fluid grace, as if unaffected by normal physical limitations, and that his eyes had reflected light in the darkness, like those of a nocturnal predator. Most unsettling was Mrs. Cortimiglia's insistence that her attacker had spoken to her during the assault, delivering a message in a voice that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. According to her account, the Axeman had told her that the violence was necessary to maintain some form of cosmic balance, that certain debts required payment in blood, and that her family had been chosen to fulfill obligations that transcended their individual lives. The supernatural elements of Mrs. Cortimiglia's testimony were largely dismissed by investigators who attributed her unusual claims to trauma-induced hallucinations. However, Dr. Rousseau's analysis of the historical record revealed that similar supernatural encounters had been reported by other survivors, suggesting a consistent pattern of otherworldly phenomena associated with the Axeman murders. The killer's final documented attack occurred on October 27, 1919, when Mike Pepitone was murdered in his home while his wife and children slept in adjacent rooms. Mrs. Pepitone discovered her husband's body the following morning, but reported that she had heard no sounds of violence during the night. The crime scene showed the familiar signs of the Axeman's methodology: a chiseled door panel, the victim's own axe used as the murder weapon, and an absence of physical evidence that might identify the perpetrator. The Pepitone murder marked the end of the documented Axeman crime spree, though the killer's sudden cessation of activity raised as many questions as his original appearance had created. No arrests were made in connection with any of the murders, no credible suspects were ever identified, and the case gradually faded from public attention as other concerns claimed the focus of law enforcement and media coverage. Dr. Rousseau's investigation into the aftermath of the Axeman murders revealed that the killer's influence on New Orleans had extended far beyond the immediate terror created by his crimes. The jazz music that he had claimed to love experienced explosive growth during and after the murder spree, as if his endorsement had provided cultural legitimacy to an art form that had previously been marginalized by respectable society. Several prominent jazz musicians of the era had composed pieces inspired by the Axeman murders, creating a musical legacy that preserved the memory of the crimes while transforming their horror into artistic expression. The mysterious Axeman's Jazz, written by Joseph John de Villa, became a popular dance tune that allowed New Orleans residents to celebrate their survival while acknowledging the lasting impact of their encounter with incomprehensible evil. The cultural transformation of the Axeman from terrifying predator to folk legend represented a form of collective psychological healing that allowed the community to integrate their traumatic experience into their ongoing cultural narrative. The killer had threatened to destroy the social fabric of New Orleans, but his crimes had ultimately strengthened the bonds that connected the city's diverse communities through their shared love of jazz music and their collective resistance to forces that sought to tear them apart. Dr. Rousseau's research expanded to include investigation of similar unsolved murders in other cities during the same time period. She discovered that several American cities had experienced crime sprees between 1918 and 1920 that bore striking similarities to the New Orleans attacks. Methodical killers who targeted specific ethnic communities left no physical evidence and seemed to possess supernatural awareness of police activities. The pattern suggested the possibility that the Axeman was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather part of a larger wave of predatory activity that swept across the United States during the period immediately following World War I. The timing coincided with massive social disruption caused by returning veterans, economic uncertainty, and cultural tensions between established communities and recent immigrants. However, the supernatural elements that distinguished the New Orleans case from other contemporary crime sprees suggested that the Axeman represented something beyond ordinary criminal activity. Dr. Rousseau's analysis of comparative cases revealed that while other cities had experienced similar patterns of violence, none had generated the consistent reports of otherworldly phenomena that characterized the New Orleans murders. The question of the Axeman's identity consumed Dr. Rousseau's research for over 2 years, as she explored every available theory about the killer's background and motivations. Contemporary investigators had suspected various individuals, including Italian grocers seeking to eliminate competition, disgruntled customers harboring ethnic prejudices, and mentally disturbed individuals with grudges against specific communities. None of these theories adequately explained the supernatural elements associated with the crimes or the killer's apparent ability to evade detection while operating in a relatively small urban area where strangers would be easily noticed. Dr. Rousseau began to consider the possibility that the Axeman might have been someone who possessed legitimate reasons to move freely through the affected neighborhoods, a police officer, medical professional, or community leader whose presence would not arouse suspicion. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Rousseau discovered a collection of personal letters in the estate of Dr. Lawrence Becker, a physician who had treated several Axeman victims during the 1918 to 1919 crime spree. The correspondence, written to colleagues in other cities, described Dr. Becker's growing conviction that the attacks were connected to supernatural forces that had been disturbed by the rapid urbanization and cultural changes occurring in early 20th century New Orleans. I have examined the wounds inflicted by this perpetrator, Dr. Becker wrote in a letter dated November 1919, and I am convinced that no human being could have caused such precisely calibrated trauma without extensive medical training and supernatural assistance. The pattern of injuries suggests someone who understands not only human anatomy, but also the metaphysical principles that govern the relationship between physical harm and psychological terror. Dr. Becker's letters revealed that he had conducted his own investigation into the supernatural aspects of the Axeman case, interviewing survivors about their dreams and psychological experiences in the months following their attacks. His findings supported Dr. Rousseau's theory that the killer had created psychic disturbances that extended far beyond the immediate physical violence of his crimes. The physician's research had led him to explore the possibility that the Axeman was not entirely human, but rather some form of entity that existed on the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. Dr. Becker had consulted with practitioners of voodoo and other traditional spiritual systems, seeking to understand whether the murders might represent the activities of a supernatural predator drawn to New Orleans by the city's unique cultural and spiritual energy. The climax of Dr. Rousseau's investigation came when she discovered a cache of evidence that had been hidden in the basement of the old Times-Picayune building since 1920. The materials, apparently collected by a reporter who had covered the Axeman story, included additional letters from the killer, photographs of crime scenes that had never been published, and detailed notes about supernatural phenomena observed by witnesses who had been reluctant to speak publicly about their experiences. The unpublished letters revealed that the Axeman had continued to correspond with the newspaper, even after his final documented murder, sending messages that gradually shifted from threats and boasts to philosophical reflections on the nature of evil and the relationship between creativity and destruction. These later communications suggested that the killer viewed his crimes not as random acts of violence, but as components of a larger artistic project that used terror and death as raw materials for cultural transformation. Jazz is the music of chaos transformed into beauty, the Axeman wrote in a letter dated December 1919, and my work serves a similar function, converting the discord of ordinary existence into harmonies that transcend human understanding. Each life I have taken has become a note in a symphony that will continue to resonate long after my physical presence has departed from your city. The final letter in the collection, dated January 1920, announced the Axeman's intention to depart from New Orleans, not because of law enforcement pressure, but because his work in the city had been completed. The message suggested that the killer viewed his crime spree as a temporary assignment, rather than the expression of permanent criminal impulses, implying that he might continue his activities in other locations where his particular services were required. Dr. Rousseau's analysis of these previously unknown communications revealed linguistic patterns and cultural references that suggested the Axeman possessed extensive education in literature, philosophy, and theology. The killer demonstrated familiarity with works by Dante, Milton, and other authors who had explored themes of supernatural evil, suggesting that he viewed his crimes within the context of classical traditions rather than as products of mental illness or social dysfunction. The investigation concluded with Dr. Rousseau's growing conviction that the Axeman represented a type of predator that transcended conventional criminal categories. The evidence suggested someone or something that combined human intelligence with supernatural capabilities, operating according to motivations that extended beyond ordinary criminal psychology into realms that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil itself. The case files that Dr. Rousseau compiled during her 2-year investigation painted a picture of New Orleans as a city that had encountered forces beyond human understanding and emerged transformed but not destroyed. The Axeman murders had introduced an element of cosmic horror into the everyday life of the community, yet the residents had responded with creativity and solidarity that ultimately defeated the killer's apparent intention to spread lasting fear and division. The jazz music that the Axeman had claimed to love became the vehicle through which New Orleans processed and overcame the trauma of his crimes. The art form that had emerged from the suffering and resilience of African American communities provided a cultural framework that allowed the entire city to transform their encounter with incomprehensible evil into an expression of defiant vitality. Modern forensic techniques applied to the preserved evidence from the Axeman crimes have failed to provide definitive answers about the killer's identity or methods. DNA analysis of biological samples collected at crime scenes has yielded results that contradict conventional expectations, genetic material that seems to combine human characteristics with sequences that do not correspond to any known species. The supernatural elements of the case have resisted scientific explanation, remaining as mysterious today as they were during the original investigation. Contemporary researchers who have attempted to debunk the otherworldly aspects of the crimes have found themselves confronting evidence that defies rational analysis, leading several to conclude that the Axeman murders represent a genuine encounter between human civilization and forces that operate according to laws that transcend ordinary physical reality. The legacy of the Axeman extends beyond the specific crimes he committed to include his influence on the cultural development of New Orleans and the evolution of jazz music. The killer's endorsement of jazz provided the art form with a form of notoriety that helped it gain national attention, contributing to its eventual recognition as America's most distinctive musical contribution to world culture. Yet the price of this cultural advancement was paid in blood by innocent families who became unwilling participants in the Axeman's artistic vision. The memory of their sacrifice continues to haunt the neighborhoods where the murders occurred, creating a perpetual reminder that creativity and destruction often emerge from the same mysterious sources. Dr. Rousseau's final report on the Axeman investigation acknowledged that many questions about the case would never be answered satisfactorily. The killer's true identity, his supernatural capabilities, and his ultimate fate remained as mysterious as they had been during the original crime spree. Yet her research had revealed that the Axeman murders represented more than a simple criminal investigation. They constituted a cultural encounter that had shaped the development of American music and demonstrated the resilience of communities faced with incomprehensible threats. The files that Dr. Rousseau compiled were eventually donated to the Louisiana State Archives, where they remain available to researchers seeking to understand one of the most bizarre and terrifying episodes in American criminal history. Her work established the Axeman case as a paradigm for crimes that transcend conventional categories, involving elements that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of human evil and the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. In her final notes on the investigation, Dr. Rousseau reflected on the lasting impact that her research had exerted on her own understanding of criminal psychology and the nature of evil itself. The Axeman case had forced her to acknowledge that some forms of predatory behavior operate according to principles that extend beyond the scope of traditional academic disciplines, requiring investigators to consider possibilities that challenge the materialistic assumptions of modern science. The story of the Axeman reminds us that evil sometimes wears the mask of sophistication and cultural refinement, hiding predatory impulses behind facades of education and artistic sensibility. The killer's appreciation for jazz music and his eloquent correspondence with the press demonstrated that creativity and destruction often spring from the same psychological sources, requiring constant vigilance to ensure that artistic impulses are channeled toward constructive rather than harmful ends. As New Orleans continues to evolve as a center of musical innovation and cultural creativity, the memory of the Axeman serves as a reminder that the city's artistic vitality emerged from struggles with forces that sought to destroy rather than create. The jazz music that defines New Orleans culture represents a triumph of human creativity over the chaos and terror that the Axeman sought to spread, transforming the energy of fear into expressions of joy and resilience that continue to inspire audiences around the world. The past guards secrets that challenge comprehension, and what we've uncovered in the shadows of the Axeman's reign reveals that some mysteries transcend the boundaries between crime and art, between human evil and supernatural malevolence. Perhaps the real question isn't whether the Axeman was human or something more sinister, but whether we have the courage to acknowledge that creativity and destruction often emerge from the same mysterious wellspring of human experience. The true nature of this legend remains in the shadows, but we want to know your opinion. Use the comment section below and tell us what you believe. If you are fascinated by unraveling the secrets behind our darkest histories, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, for there is much more to be unmasked.